Hello guys, my name is Charan HR. I am from Sri Venkateswara College of Engineering, Department of ECE. In this video, I will be discussing about two-port network parameters. I hope it will be informative and helpful to all. Introduction to two-port networks. Two-port networks can be used to represent any complex electrical networks into a simple equivalent module. The electrical components like transmission lines and transformer can be modeled into two-port network models. Similarly, electronic components like transistors and operational amplifiers can also be modeled in two-port network model. The articles gives an overview of two-port network parameters and how to calculate them. In this article, the provided the conditions for symmetric and reciprocal for the given network concerning two-port network parameters. These conditions will help to check the network whether it is symmetric or reciprocal or not. Now let us discuss about types of two-port networks and the quantities of two-port networks. In two-port networks, we can give the input to any port and similarly we can take output from any port. Since we have two electrical quantities like voltage and current, obviously the input and output also will be in those two forms. The parameters that we'll use in two-port networks are also known as two-port network parameters. Since there are four variables V1, V2 and I1, I2, we'll get 6 set of parameters from the two-port networks. Now let us see the following two-port network parameters. One is Z parameter and Y parameter, H parameter and ABCD parameters. Now let us discuss about what is Z parameter. The Z parameter is also known as impedance parameter among the four variables V1, V2 and I1, I2 of two-port networks. Let us consider I1 and I2 are independent variables and V1 and V2 are dependent variables. That means I1 and I2 are the inputs and V1 and V2 are the outputs of two-port networks. The two equations of two-port networks are corresponding Z parameters are mentioned below. V1 is equals to Z11 into I1 plus Z12 into I2. V2 is equals to Z21 into I1 plus Z22 into I2. Now by equating the equations we'll get Z11 is equals to V1 divided by I1 when I2 is equals to 0. Z12 is equals to V1 divided by I2 when I1 is equals to 0. Z21 is equals to V2 divided by I1 when I2 is equals to 0. Next, Z22 is equals to ZV1 divided by I2 when I1 is equals to 0. These are the main things of impedance parameters. Now let us see what are the main conditions required for Z parameters. Here the ratio of output means voltage and input means current gives the values of impedance and the unit are ohm. Hence the two-port network parameters are also known as impedance parameter or Z parameter. We find out two-port network Z parameter Z11 and Z21 by making port 2 as open circuit. Similarly, we can see the other Z parameters Z12 and Z22 making port 1 as open circuit. Hence, we can call Z parameter as open circuit impedance parameter. A two-port network is said to be a symmetrical network if Z11 is equals to Z22. A two-port network parameter is said to be a reciprocal if Z12 is equals to Z21. The second type of parameter is Y parameter or also known as admittance parameter. Among the four variables V1, V2 and I1, I2 of two-port networks, let us consider V1 and V2 are independent variables and I1 and I2 are dependent variables. That means V1 and V2 are input parameters and I1 and I2 are output parameters. The two equations of two-port networks that corresponding to Y parameter are mentioned below. I1 is equals to Y11 V1 plus Y12 V2. I2 is equals to Y21 into V1 plus Y22 into V2. By equating these two equations, we get Y11 is equals to I1 divided by V1 when V2 is equals to 0. When Y12 is equals to I1 divided by V2 when V1 is equals to 0. Y21 is equals to I2 divided by V1 when V2 is equals to 0. When Y22 is equals to I21 divided by V2 when V1 is equals to 0. These are the main conditions required for Y parameters or admittance parameter. The main conditions required for Y parameters. Here the ratio of output current and the input voltage gives the values of admittance and the unit for Y parameter is mho. Hence these two parameter networks are also known as admittance parameter or Y parameter. We can find two Y parameters Y1 and Y2 by making port 2 as short circuit. Similarly, we can see the other Y parameters Y12 and Y22 by making port 1 as short circuit. Here we can call Y parameter as short circuit admittance parameter. A two-port network parameter is said to be a symmetry if Y11 is equals to Y22. A two-port network is said to be a reciprocal if Y12 is equals to Y21. These are the main conditions required for Y port or Y parameter. The next type of parameter is H parameter, or also known as hybrid parameter. Among the four variables V1, V2 and I1, I2 of two-port networks, let us consider I1, V2 as independent variable and V1, I2 as dependent variable. That means I1 and V2 are input networks, whereas V1, I2 are output two-port networks. The two equations of two-port networks corresponding to the H parameter are mentioned below. V1 is equals to H11 into I1 plus H12 into V2. I2 is equals to H21 into I1 plus H22 into V2. That means by equating these two equations, we get H11 is equals to V1 divided by I1 when V2 is equals to 0. H12 is equals to V1 divided by V2 when I2 is equals to 0. H21 is equals to I2 divided by I1 when V2 is equals to 0. H22 is equals to I2 divided by V2 when I1 is equals to 0. This is the main parameter required for H parameter. The main conditions are required for H parameter. Here H12 and H21 do not have any units. That means there is no dimensions. The units of H11 and H21 are ohms and mho respectively. The H parameter are also known as hybrid parameter. We find H2 parameters by H11 and H2 by making port 2 as short circuit. Similarly, we can see the other parameters H12 and H22 by making port 1 as open circuit. A two-port network is said to be a symmetrical network if H1 is equals to 1. A two-port network is said to be a reciprocal if H12 is equals to H21. Next, the last type of parameter is ABCD parameters. ABCD parameter is also known as transmission parameter or T parameter. Among the four variables V1, V2 and I1, I2 of two-port networks, let us consider V1 and I1 are independent variables and V2 and I2 are dependent variables. This means V1 and I1 are inputs and V2 and I2 are outputs in two-port networks. The two equations of two-port networks corresponding to T parameter are mentioned below. V2 is equals to A dash V1 minus B dash I2. I2 is equals to C dash V1 minus D dash I1. That means by equating these two equations, we get A dash is equals to V2 into V1 means when Y is equals to 0. B dash is equals to V2 into I1 when V1 is equals to 0. C dash is equals to I2 into V1 when I1 is equals to 0. D dash is equals to I2 into I1 when V1 is equals to 0. These are the main parameters or conditions required for ABCD parameters. The main conditions required for ABCD parameters are here A dash and D dash do not have any units. That means there is no dimensions. And B dash and D dash have the dimensions. That means their units is ohms and mho respectively. A dash, B dash, C dash and D dash parameters are also known as transmission parameter or T parameter. We find the two T parameters as A dash and C dash by making port 1 as open circuit. Similarly, we can see the other T parameters by B dash and D dash by making port 1 as short circuit. A port is said to be a symmetric port if A dash is equals to D dash. A two-port network is said to be a reciprocal. A dash D dash minus B dash C dash is equals to 1. These are the main conditions required for ABCD parameters or inverse transmission parameters. Network analysis is the main subject or core subject in electronics and communication engineering. I hope it will be informative and understood to all. Thank you for watching this video. Please like, share and subscribe.